Which oppression was worse, the oppression of women or the oppression of African Americans or blacks?
They used to eat us.
Really?
Wait, what? Eat?
African Americans were eaten. Do they not teach this? They were eaten, turned
You think
into
there was
furniture?
widespread cannibalism in the United States?
This was with a specific lady in New Orleans, and she I know who you're talking about.
Wait, hold on. One example of cannibalism is not evidence of widespread.
They used to skin us and make leather out of it. Like, why is that even a question?
I think he's saying because you're only pointing to like one example.
It's not one example.
1837 on the Portuguese slave ship, the Aragante, the captain killed an enslaved man, cooked him, and made the other enslaved people eat him. And the crew ate the organs. In 1831, after Nat Turner's rebellion, they desecrated his body after his execution, and then some sources state that they boiled down his body to a medicinal substance for white people to consume as an act of final triumph. Vincent Woodward has a whole book about the incidents of this happening, the consumption of black bodies, not just literally, but physically, intimately. It's well documented. And within that book, there's another slave owner, a Kentucky man, who butchers and cooks an enslaved person in front of other enslaved people as a form of psychological terror. And then in 1888, the Mercury in Philadelphia releases an expose exposing white doctors who are tanning the skin of black people to make shoes and cigar boxes. One of the physicians was quoted as saying that black skin makes a specifically enduring leather. There was also cases in Mississippi of them making belts and purses and things from black skin. They also used black babies as alligator bait. That's documented in multiple sources. They thought it was so hysterical they made postcards about it. Would use them as bait to hunt alligators, or would just feed them to alligators. If you really want to go for a wild ride and you can stomach the truth, Thomas Thistlewood's diaries, called the Thomas Thistlewood Papers or the Thistlewood Papers, the slave owner himself kept a documented, detailed diary of all of the torture he inflicted on his slaves, including 3,800 cases plus of SA against black women, probably one of the most common crimes across the slave trade against black women. And he also invented what was called the Derby's dose, where he would flog a slave and then rub pickle juice or lime juice into their skin and then make another enslaved person defecate in their mouth. Typically, those kind of infractions would be eating a piece of sugar cane because they were hungry. And no, Miss Ma'am, you don't know who you're talking about. Madame Lalaurie did not eat her slaves. What she did do is chain them up with iron collars where she tortured, mutilated them, peeled their skin into strange shapes, and then murdered them. Just because you people are not educated enough to know what actually happened and you don't want to believe it because it makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean it didn't happen.
There's a book called The Delectable Negro that documents the cannibalizing of black people, especially during slavery. It talks about how in white European culture, the white supremacist culture, that they've always had this thing about literally consuming black people, black flesh. During slavery, when they had the big rebellion with Nat Turner, he was cannibalized after they killed him. They ate him. During a lot of lynchings, they would cook and barbecue people, and they would actually eat the people that they would lynch. So this was something that was a part of the white supremacist culture, consuming us literally.
I'm sure you've heard all the tales about slavery, or at least you think how they's whipped, how they's treated like cattle. I'm sure you've heard all that. But I bet you didn't know that slave owners also treated them like chicken, like beef. What's for dinner? They did that. The revolutionary Nat Turner was cooked up, his entrails and all. They even offered to feed them to the people of color, and they wouldn't do it. The revolutionary, And people ignored this for a long time, this fact that this homoeroticism of slave owners and their slaves. They've ignored all this. They ignored the slaves, their voice, Because that's a horrible thing to think of, that these slave owners, not only they starved their slaves because the less you feed them, the more money you make. They also was what was for dinner. You know what I mean? You don't hear none of this. How they look down. There's a sexual innuendo. Homosexuality was also a thing back in them days. This is all going on, You've heard of how the founders, raped their slaves. Well, that was part of their meals as well. Yeah, well, I know it's taboo now. That was just the culture back in them days. But this fella here, I'll put up his book here. He goes into it, and he's this scholar, academic, the original author is passed, but this was his life's work right here. He wanted to show the cruelty and the inhumanity of it. Even abolitionists had a ship, I think, up there in New England, whaling ship, and they had to eat a cup of their of color on that ship. You know, they just didn't see much wrong with it back in 1800s. So yeah, this is stuff you don't hear about the slave trade. This is stuff that's, you know, mum's the word, so to speak. But it was a horrible thing. That's why we need to eliminate it in the carceral system, because they used them to come up with these medical procedures for women and men. You know, medical apartheid was a thing. That's how we learned a lot of procedures and come up with all these vaccines, is treating people of color, slaves, like guinea pigs. I mean, it's just plumb horrible what we done to them, that race of people back in them days, and still do today.